The abandoned town lost, deep in the Appalachian Mountains and its dark forgotten past. There are places in this world that time does not simply forget, places that time buries, deliberately beneath layers of silence and rotting wood and mountain fog so thick it swallows sound whole. The abandoned town lost deep in the Appalachian Mountains and its dark forgotten past is one such place. And unlike the ghost towns of the American West, where miners packed their bags and moved on when the gold ran dry, this place was not abandoned because people left. This place was abandoned because of what the people who stayed became. What generations of isolation, of closed bloodlines, of a family that turned entirely inward upon itself, eventually produced. This is not a story about poverty alone, though poverty soaked every rotting plank of every structure still standing in those hills. This is not a story about ignorance alone, though ignorance was as thick as the fog that never fully lifted from the valley. This is the story of the Duggan family. 3 souls, if souls is still the right word for what remained in those ruined bodies, who lived together in a collapsing farmhouse at the end of a dirt road that no map had ever acknowledged. 3 people whose faces told the story of what happens when a bloodline folds back on itself, generation after generation, decade after decade, until the human form itself begins to protest in the most visible and devastating of ways. Their names were Elmer, Marvella, and Roscoe Duggan, and they were, in every sense that mattered, the last chapter of a very long and very dark story. To understand the Duggans, you must first understand the land that made them. The Appalachian Mountains stretch from Alabama in the south to Maine in the north, a spine of ancient stone that was already old when the first European settlers pushed westward into its hollows and coves. These mountains are not dramatic in the way of the Rockies. They do not announce themselves with sharp white peaks and vertical faces. They seduce. They swallow. Their ridgelines roll one into the next, each valley a little deeper, each hollow a little darker, each creek a little more difficult to follow back to any road you might recognize. Settlers moved into these mountains in the 18th century, Scots, Irish, and English families carrying their surnames and their stubborn independence, and their deep suspicion of anything beyond the next ridge. They built communities that were, by design and by geography, largely closed off from the outside world. Marriages happened within these communities, not out of malice, not out of intention, but because the nearest neighboring family might be 4 hours on foot through terrain that killed the careless. Generation followed generation. Bloodlines that should have spread outward instead circled back. And in certain hollows, in certain places where the terrain was especially unforgiving and the families especially isolated, the consequences of that closed-circuit living began to accumulate in the bodies of the children. The hollow where the Duggans lived had no official name on any county record. Local people in the nearest town, a small community called Harlan's Fork, itself barely a crossroads with a post office and a feed store, called it simply the Back Hollow. They said it with a particular flatness of tone, the way you say the name of something you have decided not to think about too carefully. The road into the Back Hollow was a single-lane dirt track that branched off a paved county road about 6 miles outside of Harlan's Fork. By the time you reached the end of that track, you had climbed 400 feet in elevation, crossed 3 creek beds that became impassable after rain, and passed through 2 rusted gates whose hinges had long since fused with age. At the end of that road sat the Duggan place, a 2-story farmhouse built sometime in the late 1800s, by which time the Duggan line had already been folding back on itself for at least 3 documented generations. The house had once been white. By the time anyone from the outside world made it out there in any official capacity, the paint had long since peeled and grayed and vanished into the wood beneath, and the wood itself was doing its best to return to the earth it had come from. The porch sagged. 2 of the upper-story windows were boarded. The chimney had partially collapsed, leaving a dark gap in the roofline like a missing tooth. And inside that house, and on that porch, and in the overgrown yard that surrounded it, lived Elmer, Marvella, and Roscoe Duggan. The last of their line. The end of something that had been ending for a very long time. Elmer Duggan was 67 years old when the outside world finally, formally, took notice of the family in the Back Hollow. 67 years old, though the body that housed those years looked as though it had been carrying twice that weight. He was a gaunt man, gaunt in the way that suggests not simply thinness, but a kind of structural dissolution, as though the body was in the process of renegotiating its own architecture. He moved with a permanent hunch, his spine curving under some internal gravity that seemed to pull him always slightly downward and forward, as if the earth had a particular interest in reclaiming him. His hair, what remained of it, was white and patchy, growing in uneven clusters across a scalp that showed dark lesions between the follicles, scabbed and discolored against the pale skin. His face was the first thing that people who saw him described, always when they tried to explain what they had witnessed. His left eye bulged forward from its socket in a way that suggested the tissue behind it had expanded beyond the capacity of the orbit. The eye itself clouded to a milky white. The vessels within it burst and spreading like dark tributaries across a pale landscape. His right eye told the opposite story, deeply sunken in a socket that had darkened around its edges, the flesh around it softening and losing definition in a way that suggested an ongoing process rather than a settled condition. His jaw had reorganized itself around what the county health worker who eventually visited described simply as advanced deterioration of the oral tissue. The lower teeth protruding at angles that teeth were not meant to achieve, the gum tissue that should have anchored them having partially receded into something darker and looser, the cheek on one side showing a softness that was not the softness of fat, but of something giving way. Along his jawline, where the skin met the neck, there were open areas. Not wounds in any conventional sense, not injuries from any external cause, but places where the tissue had simply opened, weeping a dark fluid that stained the collar of the flannel shirt he wore every day, winter and summer, buttoned to the throat. He wore dirty suspenders over that shirt, and torn brown trousers, and cracked leather boots, whose soles had separated at the toes and been reattached with wire. He was Elmer Dugan. He was 67 years old. He had never lived more than 4 miles from the house where he was born. He had never needed to. The world he inhabited was the back hollow, and the back hollow was the world he inhabited. And in that world, he was the patriarch, the eldest, the one who made the decisions, the one who set the terms of whatever daily existence the three of them maintained behind those rusted gates. Marvella Dugan was 62 years old. She was Elmer's sister. She was also, by the time the genealogical records were eventually pieced together by a researcher from a state university who became fascinated and then disturbed by the Dugan family history, something considerably more complicated than simply his sister, the bloodline between them having folded and refolded through previous generations in ways that made the precise nature of their relationship a matter of some calculation. She was a thin woman, thin in a way that made her appear assembled from angles rather than curves, every joint a sharp point beneath the fabric of the long black dress she wore. Her hair was long and white-gray and stringy, hanging forward over her face in a way that seemed less like a style than like a consequence, as though it had grown and fallen and never been redirected. The right side of her face was in a condition that the health worker described in her report as presenting extensive tissue deterioration consistent with prolonged systemic compromise. The flesh on that side had pulled away from the underlying bone structure in a way that was slow and ongoing, the cheekbone becoming visible not as something sharp and prominent in the way of a gaunt face, but as something being gradually revealed by the retreat of the tissue that had covered it, a dark hollow forming below the right eye where the tissue had thinned beyond what could be sustained. Her right eye in that darkened hollow was clouded over in the same milky white as Elmer's left, the surrounding tissue blackened and soft in a way that made the eye appear to float in something that was no longer quite the architecture of a face. Her left eye, by contrast, was startlingly alive. Unnaturally sharp, dark, intensely present. An eye that watched everything and gave away nothing. An eye that made the people who encountered her feel that whatever they were reading on her face, she was reading considerably more on theirs. Her neck was thin, the skin there showing dark lines that traced upward from the collar of her dress, like the spread of something moving through the tissue beneath. Her lower jaw on the right side had undergone changes that mirrored what was happening to her cheek. The gum tissue darkened and receding, the teeth on that side exposed not by a smile, but by an absence of the tissue that should have surrounded them. She walked barefoot always, the soles of her feet cracked and calloused from decades of contact with the dirt floors and the rocky ground of the back hollow. She was Marvella Dugan. She had lived her entire 62 years within the same 4 miles as Elmer. She cooked what food they had, kept what order existed in the house, and watched everything with that one sharp, living eye. Roscoe Dugan was 44 years old. He was the son of Elmer and Marvella, a fact that the county records once examined confirmed with a flatness that the records themselves seemed ill-equipped to carry. He was a heavy-set man, heavy-set in the way that suggested not nourishment, but something gone wrong with the basic processes of the body, a bloating, a swelling, a tissue that had expanded beyond its intended parameters and then continued expanding in directions that seemed driven by something internal and uncontrolled. His face was the most immediately striking of the three, which was itself a significant statement given the company it kept. The skin of his face was pulled tight over the swollen tissue beneath it, discolored in shades of green-gray that shifted in different lights, blistered across the surface in a way that suggested the skin was no longer fully equal to the task of containing what lay beneath it. His left cheek had caved inward, not from any injury but from an internal dissolution, the tissue there having given way and left a dark, hollow cavity that showed clearly when the light caught it from the side. His left eyelid had fused shut with a discharge that had dried and hardened and eventually become structural, the eye behind it no longer visible, no longer apparently relevant to the operation of his face. Where his nose had been, there was now a dark cavity, the cartilage that should have given the nose its shape having dissolved entirely, leaving an opening that was roughly triangular and entirely unobstructed, the interior darker than the surrounding skin. His lips had pulled away from his teeth in the way of something contracting and blackening at the edges, his gums having receded to the degree that his teeth appeared longer than teeth were meant to be, some of them visibly loose in their settings, some already lost and the spaces they had left now part of the general reorganization of his lower face. He wore a torn undershirt, stained with the dark fluid that various surfaces of his face produced, held up by a rope belt against a pair of filthy canvas pants, his feet bare and hardened like Marvella's. Roscoe Dugan was 44 years old. He rarely spoke. When he did, the sounds he produced were difficult to pass as language, not because he lacked the capacity for thought, but because the physical apparatus of speech, lip position, tongue placement, the shaping of air into recognizable phonemes, had been compromised by the condition of his mouth and face to a degree that made his words approximate rather than precise. He communicated primarily through gesture, through posture, through the single functioning eye that tracked movement with an alertness that was, like his mother's surviving eye, disconcerting in its intensity. The documented history of the Dugan family, as a distinct and traceable lineage in that region of the Appalachians, begins in the historical record around 1847, when a land deed was filed in the county courthouse in the name of one Caleb Dugan, a man described in the accompanying documentation simply as a farmer of that county. The land he claimed was the Hollow, those same ridges, those same creek beds, that same dirt track that would eventually become the road to nowhere that Elmer and Marvella and Roscoe inhabited more than a century later. Caleb Dugan was, as best as later researchers could determine, a man of Scottish descent whose family had made its way through Virginia and into the mountain regions sometime in the early 1800s. He married a woman whose maiden name appeared in various records as either Tatum or Tatham, the handwriting in 19th-century rural county records being itself a kind of obstacle to clarity. And they had children, and those children grew up in the Hollow, and when the time came for those children to marry, the nearest available partners were, geographically and socially speaking, not very far removed from the Dugan bloodline itself. This was not in the beginning an intentional closing of the line. It was a consequence of terrain and of the particular social architecture of mountain communities in that era and that region. Families married into neighboring families shared by that point a generation or two of common ancestry. The circles were small, and when you move in small circles long enough, the circles begin to overlap in ways that create consequences. The history of what happens to human populations that marry within too narrow a range of genetic relationship is not mysterious. It has been documented, studied, and understood for well over a century. Every human being carries within their genetic material a small number of variants, errors in the code, disruptions in the instruction set, that are recessive, meaning they require two copies, one inherited from each parent, in order to express themselves in the body. In a large genetically diverse population, the odds of any individual inheriting the same recessive variant from both parents are low, because the two parents are unlikely to share that particular variant. But in a population where parents share common ancestry, where they may have inherited the same recessive variants from the same original source, those odds increase. The closer the relationship, the more likely the overlap. Children born to closely related parents have a significantly elevated chance of inheriting two copies of any recessive variants their shared ancestors carried. And when those variants express themselves, they do so in the body, in the development of organs, of facial structure, of the immune system, of the tissue that covers and protects and holds the body together. The Dugan family, by the time Elmer and Marvella were born, had been circling within its own bloodline for what the genealogical research eventually suggested was at minimum 4 generations of close relation unions, and possibly 5. The effects on the family across those generations were not uniform, not predictable, and not in any individual case fully explicable by the records available. But the direction of travel was clear. The bodies were changing, the faces were changing, and the changes were accumulating rather than resolving. What makes the Duggan story particularly difficult to examine clearly is the near-total absence of medical documentation from the family's earlier generations. There were no birth certificates for Elmer and Marvella that could be located. There were no hospital records, no records of any physician having visited the back hollow in any official capacity during the decades in which the family was raising its children, such as that raising was. The county had, in theory, mechanisms for reaching families in isolated rural situations. A public health nurse who made rounds, a county welfare office that was supposed to maintain awareness of households in need. In practice, the back hollow was too far, the road too bad, the family too invisible in the records for any of those mechanisms to have engaged with them. The Duggans paid no property taxes that could be traced after a certain point. They appeared on no voter registration rolls. They received no mail at any address that anyone could locate. They were, in the official sense, almost entirely absent from the documented world. 3 human beings living in a condition that the official world had not taken the trouble to notice or record. The first formal documentation of the family in their late years came from a county sheriff's deputy named Gerald Putnam, who drove the dirt track into the back hollow in early spring following a tip from a Harlan's Fork resident who had encountered Roscoe at the edge of the paved county road, apparently attempting, for reasons that Roscoe was unable or unwilling to communicate, to cross into the ditch on the opposite side. Deputy Putnam's incident report, which became one of the primary source documents for everything that was subsequently written and recorded about the Duggans, is a model of bureaucratic understatement. He describes his arrival at the property, his encounter with Roscoe in the yard, his eventual entry into the house where he found Elmer on the porch and Marvella visible through the front window. He describes their physical appearances in terms that are both clinical and clearly the product of a man searching for language adequate to what he was seeing and finding his vocabulary insufficient. He notes the condition of the house, the collapsed interior ceiling in one room, the absence of functional plumbing, the wood stove that was the only source of heat and cooking both. He notes the food situation, which was described as extremely limited. Some dried and preserved items, a garden plot behind the house that had been worked but yielded poorly in the thin mountain soil. He notes that none of the 3 individuals appeared to be in immediate danger of death, though he acknowledged in his report that he was not medically qualified to make that assessment with confidence. He called for a welfare check follow-up and left. The welfare follow-up came 3 weeks later, in the form of a county social worker named Patricia Hale, who drove the dirt track with rather more difficulty than Deputy Putnam had described, and arrived at the Duggan property on a morning when the fog was particularly thick in the hollow, the kind of fog that makes distances uncertain and sounds directionless. Patricia Hale's subsequent report and the interview she gave years later to the university researcher who was documenting the family's history provide the most detailed and personal account of what it was to encounter Elmer, Marvella, and Roscoe Duggan in their home. She described the smell first, the dense, layered smell of the house, which she characterized as something between the smell of old wood and the smell of something biological that she could not precisely identify. She described the darkness of the interior, the boarded windows, the single lamp burning something that might have been rendered fat, the way the light it produced seemed to thicken the shadows rather than push them back. She described Marvella coming to the door, Marvella with her long grey-white hair hanging forward, and her sharp, living left eye finding Patricia Hale's face immediately and holding it with an attention that Hale described as the most uncomfortable, sustained eye contact she had ever experienced. She described Elmer emerging from an interior room, the hunch of him, the bulging, clouded left eye, the open areas along his jaw, and she described Roscoe, who appeared from somewhere at the back of the house and stood in the doorway to what had been a kitchen, his bloated face, his caved cheek, the dark cavity where his nose had been, watching her with the single open eye that tracked her movement with an animal precision. She did not leave immediately. She was a professional, and her professionalism held, though she described it as holding in the way that something holds under more weight than it was designed for, with a kind of audible internal stress. She sat with Elmer and Marvella at a table in the front room, a table that had been built, she noted, from what appeared to be the wood of a door laid across two sawhorses and never refined further, and she attempted a conversation. The conversation was difficult. Elmer spoke in a manner she described as intelligible but effortful, his articulation affected by the condition of his mouth and jaw to a degree that required her to listen very carefully to pass what he was saying. What he said, once she had passed it, was not the response of a man without comprehension or awareness. He knew the county had sent her. He knew roughly what the county's interest in them was. He expressed without hostility, but with a flatness that she found more unsettling than anger would have been, that they did not require assistance and did not want interference. Marvella said very little. When she did speak, her articulation was clearer than Elmer's, and what she said was even fewer words, but those words were chosen with a precision that Hale remembered verbatim years later. What Marvella said at the end of the meeting, as Patricia Hale was gathering herself to leave, was, "We have always been here. We will be here when you have gone back to wherever you came from. This is our place." Roscoe said nothing at all. He remained in the kitchen doorway for the entire visit, not moving, not gesturing, the single open eye tracking every movement in the room with an attention that Hale compared, in her later interview, to the attention of something that was trying to understand a situation it had encountered for the first time. The medical consultation that followed Patricia Hale's report was conducted at a distance. A county health physician reviewed her descriptions and Deputy Putnam's report and made a series of observations that the researcher later characterized as cautious to the point of being almost deliberately uninformative. The physician noted that the physical presentations described were consistent with a range of possible conditions, some of which could be related to environmental factors, exposure, nutritional deficiency, the absence of dental and medical care over a lifetime, and some of which might be consistent with genetic conditions that expressed in dermatological and craniofacial ways. He recommended a formal medical evaluation, but noted that absent an emergency situation or evidence of incapacity, the individuals in question could not be compelled to accept one. The evaluation never happened. The Duggans declined, through Patricia Hale on her second visit, with a completeness and a finality that left no interpretive ambiguity. Marvella had spoken for all three of them. They were not interested in evaluation. They were not interested in assistance. They were, she made clear, capable of managing their own existence, had been doing so for their entire lives, and intended to continue doing so. What the outside world's brief and awkward encounter with the Duggan family could not fully account for was what the interior life of that existence actually looked like, what Elmer and Marvella and Roscoe did with the hours of their days, what they thought about, how they understood themselves and each other and the world beyond the rusted gates. The researcher, who spent several years piecing together the family's history, came at this question from the available evidence, the physical evidence of the house, eventually examined in detail, and the accounts of the few people who had direct contact with the family. What that evidence suggested was a life of profound and self-contained functionality, which is to say, a life that worked on its own terms in the way that something adapted to a specific and unusual environment works. They grew food, imperfectly but persistently, in the garden behind the house. They hunted, there were tools for this, traps and an old rifle, with an apparent competence that kept them in protein through the lean months. They maintained the house in the way that people maintain something they intend to keep, not with any cosmetic attention, but with a structural seriousness. The roof had been patched in multiple places, with materials sourced from what was available. The chimney collapse had been partially addressed with stacked stone. The porch had been reinforced with lumber that appeared to have come from one of the outbuildings that had been sacrificed for the purpose. They had, in other words, an economy, a closed, self-referential economy of effort and resource, operating entirely within the bounds of the hollow and asking nothing of any system beyond it. What the researcher found most striking, in the testimony of the two outside individuals who had spent any significant time with the family, was the degree to which the three Duggans appeared to function as a coherent unit. Not a dysfunctional one, not a household in chaos or in conflict, not three people enduring each other's presence under duress. A coherent unit. Patricia Hale noted in her later interview that what she had observed in the front room of the Duggan house was a family, and she used that word carefully, aware of its complications in this context, that had clear roles, clear communication, even when that communication was largely non-verbal, clear mutual orientation toward shared goals that she was not in a position to fully understand, but could recognize as operative. Elmer was the one who spoke to the outside world when it appeared. Marvella was the one who managed the interior, the food, the heat, the organization of the house. Roscoe was, as best Hale could determine, the one who performed the physical work that the other two were less capable of. The maintenance, the heavier aspects of the garden, the hunting. 3 people, 3 roles, a functioning system, a system that had been functioning in one form or another since long before any of them were born. The darkness of the Duggan story is not ultimately located in the condition of their faces, or the state of their house, or the particulars of their poverty. Those things are the surface, terrible and real, but surface. The darkness is located deeper, in the accumulation of choices and circumstances that produced those 3 individuals in that hollow, across a span of time long enough to have involved people who were not themselves responsible for what they were setting in motion. The original settlers who moved into the mountains were not trying to produce a lineage that would, 6 or 7 generations later, arrive at Elmer and Marvella and Roscoe. They were trying to survive in a harsh landscape with limited resources and limited options for partnership. The isolation that closed the bloodline was not chosen in any meaningful sense. It was imposed by terrain and by the social geography of a world where the nearest neighbor was hours away on foot. The consequences of that imposed isolation were not understood by the people experiencing them, or if they were sensed in some way, if there was some awareness passed quietly from generation to generation that something was accumulating in the Duggan line, that the children were arriving in the world with more difficulty and more difference than children should. That awareness did not produce any mechanism for addressing it, because the mechanisms for addressing it did not exist within the world as the Duggans experienced it. By the time Elmer and Marvella were born, the die had been cast across multiple generations before them. By the time Roscoe was born, it had been cast again, one final time, with a completeness that the genealogical record could only gesture at from a clinical distance. The 3 of them were the product of that accumulation, 3 human beings shaped in the most literal sense by the history of the bloodline they had inherited. Their faces were not their fault. Their isolation was not entirely their fault. What they were was the consequence of a process that had begun long before any of them drew their first breath in that hollow, and that had concluded, as far as could be determined, with them. Because there were no children after Roscoe, because the line had finally run into a biological wall that it could not get around. The Duggan property was formally examined by county authorities in the late fall of the year, following Patricia Hale's second visit, after Roscoe was found near the county road for the second time, this time in a condition that did constitute a medical emergency. What happened next? The brief, distressing intervention by the county health system, the period of institutionalization that none of the 3 Duggans survived for any significant length of time, the legal proceedings that attempted to address the property and the family's situation, is documented in county records that are publicly available but rarely consulted because the case attracted very little formal attention. It was not a murder case. It was not a criminal case of any conventional kind. It was, in the county's administrative framing, a welfare case, a family in an extreme situation, requiring intervention, receiving intervention too late and in a form too foreign to what they had always known to produce any outcome other than the one it produced. Elmer died within months of leaving the hollow in a county care facility that he reportedly never spoke a word in, not to the staff, not to the other residents, not to anyone. Marvella survived him by a matter of weeks. The official cause of death in both cases was recorded with the kind of bureaucratic shorthand that serves the administrative record without illuminating anything. Systemic organ failure, the record said for Elmer. Cardiac event, it said, for Marvella. What it did not say, because county death certificates are not equipped to say such things, was that what killed them was, at least in part, the act of removal from the only context in which they had ever functioned. That being taken out of the hollow and placed in a fluorescent-lit institutional world was itself, for bodies and minds, formed entirely in isolation, a kind of violence, the gentlest possible violence, entirely well-intentioned, but violence nonetheless. Roscoe lasted longer. He was the youngest. He was also in some ways the most lost, the one for whom the transition from the interior world of the Duggan Hollow to the exterior world of institutional care was perhaps the largest distance to cross. He died in the same facility as his parents, 2 years after Elmer, 3 seasons after Marvella. He was 46 years old. The house in the back hollow still stands, or stood as of the last time anyone made the effort to drive the dirt track and check. The county took possession of the property through a process of administrative attrition. No taxes had ever been paid that could be located, no will existed, There were no heirs, because there were no surviving relatives and no documentation of any. The house was deemed structurally unsafe and recommended for demolition, but the demolition, like the welfare intervention that preceded it, was slow in coming. The garden plot behind the house went unworked and returned to weeds and then to the early stages of what would eventually be forest. The wood stove sat cold. The lamp that burned, rendered fat, sat on the table where Elma and Marvella had sat across from Patricia Hale. The kitchen doorway where Roscoe had stood was dark and empty. The fog that rolled through the hollow on cold mornings did not know anything had changed. The ridgelines did not care. The mountain, which had been there before the first Duggan broke ground in 1847, and which would be there long after the last evidence of their presence had rotted back into the soil, continued to be a mountain, indifferent and enormous and entirely unmoved by the story it had witnessed, the way mountains always are. The Duggan family is not unique in American history, in the broad sense that isolated communities producing genetic consequences through restricted bloodlines is a documented phenomenon in multiple regions and multiple eras of this country's past. There are records from other Appalachian counties, from isolated island communities on the eastern seaboard, from remote western settlements that found themselves cut off by geography, all of which describe similar patterns: the narrowing of the gene pool, the expression of recessive traits, the visible accumulation of consequence across generations. What makes the Duggan case distinctive is its completeness. The line ran its full course within a documented historical frame. It started, it ran, it ended. 3 people, the last 3, were present at the ending. And whatever the suffering that their particular forms involved, whatever the experience of moving through the world in bodies that carried visibly on their surface the weight of their bloodline's entire history, those 3 people were there, in that hollow, functioning, persisting, alive in their own specific and unrepeatable way, until the outside world decided they needed to be saved, and in saving them, finished what the biology had been, in the process of concluding on its own terms, and in its own time. There is a particular kind of sorrow that attaches to the Duggan story that is difficult to locate precisely. It is not simply the sorrow of seeing human beings in a condition of extreme physical suffering, though that is present. It is not simply the sorrow of poverty and isolation and the failure of larger systems to see and respond to people in need, though that is present too. It is the sorrow of a story that has no villain. There is no person, no single decision, no identifiable moment of choice or malice that produced what the Duggan Hollow eventually produced. There is only accumulation, the accumulation of geography and poverty and isolation and time and biology, all moving in the same direction for long enough to arrive at 3 people sitting in a house at the end of a dirt road that no map acknowledged, looking out at a world that had never really looked back at them, and doing what every living thing does in whatever circumstances it finds itself: persisting, getting through the days, finding in the closed world available to them whatever constituted meaning or purpose or the simple satisfaction of continued existence. They were the Duggans. They were the last of something. They were, in whatever way is still available to them, gone. And the hollow where they lived is quiet now, and the fog comes and goes, and the mountain does not explain itself to anyone. The story of what the Appalachian isolation produced, in the most extreme and least examined of its cases, does not end with the Duggans in the sense that it ends with them and nowhere else. It ends with them in the sense that they were the furthest point a particular journey reached, the outermost limit of what a closed bloodline, left entirely to its own devices across enough generations, will eventually arrive at. But the conditions that produced them, the geography and the poverty and the social isolation, and the absence of the kind of outside engagement that might have interrupted the process at some earlier, more recoverable point, those conditions were not unique to the back hollow. They existed, and in certain places continue to exist in various forms across the mountain regions of this country, in the hollows and coves and remote valleys, where the terrain still imposes a kind of separation from the connected world that most Americans experience as simply the world. The Duggan story is the far end of a spectrum. The spectrum itself is longer than any single story can contain. What the university researcher, who spent years on this project, ultimately concluded, in the paper she eventually published in a journal of Appalachian studies, was that the Duggan family represented a convergence of factors so complete and so mutually reinforcing that it was, in a sense, overdetermined, that given the starting conditions and the duration of the isolation and the absence of any intervening mechanism, something like what the Duggan Hollow produced was, if not inevitable in its precise details, then at least the logical terminus of the trajectory the family had been on since Caleb Duggan filed that land deed in 1847. This is a cold way to look at 3 human lives. The researcher acknowledged it as such. She also argued, and she argued it carefully, that the coldness of that framing was in itself a kind of evidence. Evidence that the systems that should have been warm, the county welfare office, the public health infrastructure, the educational system that should have reached into even the most remote of hollows and made its presence felt, had been cold first, had been absent first, had looked the other way long enough for the story to reach its conclusion before they showed up to manage the aftermath. The Duggans did not happen in a vacuum. They happened in a county, in a state, in a country, in a system of provision and care and civic responsibility that failed them across their entire lifetimes and across the lifetimes of the generations that preceded them. That failure is not dramatic. It produced no single moment of identifiable wrongdoing. It was quiet, ongoing, and complete. And it is part of the story whether the story is comfortable with it or not. The dirt track into the back hollow is still there. The rusted gates are still there. The house, the last time anyone made the drive, was still standing, barely, and with less of itself than before, the roof having failed in a new section, and the porch having finally given way entirely and collapsed into the weedy ground below it. The garden plot is indistinguishable from the surrounding growth. The wood stove, visible through the broken window that had once been boarded but was no longer, sat exactly where it had always sat. The fog comes into the hollow in the morning and leaves in the afternoon and comes back in the evening. The creek beds run fast after rain and slow in the dry months. The ridgelines look the same from the bottom of the hollow as they always have, close and layered, and going on in both directions further than the eye can follow. The Duggans are gone. What they were is gone with them. What produced them is a history that the mountain holds without commentary, the way mountains hold everything, without judgment, without explanation, without any apparent awareness that the story they witnessed was anything other than one more thing that happened in one more hollow, in one more range of very old hills, in a country that is full of hollows and full of old hills and full of stories that happened in them that nobody ever fully wrote down. This is one of those stories. It happened. It is over. The town, if the Duggan place can be called a town, which it cannot in any conventional sense, but which the surrounding community called it in the way that isolated family properties in those mountains were sometimes called, as a shorthand for the fact that they constituted their own complete world. The town is gone. The people are gone. The fog remains. The mountain remains. And the story, which should have been seen and attended to long before it reached its conclusion, remains also, quiet and difficult and necessary and true. If you enjoy forgotten stories like this one, subscribe to the channel, because there are still many secrets waiting to be told.